Yun, booyaka siya too.
Yeah,
Kamusta,
siya.
bro? Looking very professorial, bro. Kamusta ka naman dyan?
Okay naman. Buhay pa.
Yan. Okay. I know you want to go to jiu-jitsu soon, so let's keep this short and sharp. But before that, because I want to talk about something quite serious about with you. I mean, maybe we have to do another episode on BRICS currency because I did a kind of a vlog about that. Maybe we can do something about that later on. But I want to, before going about global financial markets, I want to talk about the Philippines finance history, right? Because the finance history is also one way to understand why we are where we are today, understanding corruption, cronyism, Karenism, and I would say Karen capitalism, not crony capitalism. All right. No, but before that, what is your take on this Marcos thing, right? Like, what is your reading of that? Because I just had an article about it on Nikkei Asia, but it's not my first article on the issue. But suddenly I'm getting response. Marami na nanonood sa atin bigla ngayon dahil doon sa comments ni Daryl Yap sa akin. My goodness. Napatulan yan. But what's going on there, bro? What is your, as a historian, is there like a precedence for supposed sibling rivalry? Do we have anything like
Wala. Wow, great question. Wala
right?
akong maisip.
We have
Wala akong maisip. Pero bro, grabe no, parang actually this has been one of the defining characteristics of this regime na na may tunggalian with IB kasi naalala ko first week pa lang, 'di ba, yung opening veto ni Bongbong sa free trade
sa
zone.
Bulacan. Yeah, sa Bulacan.
Sa Bulacan, 'di ba?
Yeah.
Tapos naalala ko yung press conference ni IB, yung gulat na gulat siya, yung parang hindi ko pinakausap ang Malacanang pero hindi ko alam kung saan nanggaling yung veto na yun, 'di ba? Parang yun yung opening salvo and yung
Vic Rodriguez na lang sisisihin niya ngayon, no?
Si Vic Rodriguez. Pero parang grabe. Kasi yung first few weeks ng Marcos administration, ang daming sinampal, 'di ba? Yung parang hindi naging speaker si GMA. Sampal si GMA, tapos hindi nag-defend si Sara, sampal si Sara, vinito yung bill ni Amy, sampal si Amy. So nung unang linggo na yon, parang nung nawindang si Amy, parang akala ko this is just part of Bongbong. Parang nag-aangas lang siya, is just trying to say like
sinong
parang,
lalaki? Sinong macho?
I'm my own man. Pero now that it's
Yeah.
such a consistent pattern, parang starting to think parang it's more than just Bongbong telling people who's boss. I don't know, you know.
No, for me, I always said, diba, I wrote a piece before na kumbaga kung my gun girl, my gun boy din. Someone who'll be out of character at some moment. Na all his life is in the shadow of powerful women. Once he's the president with a 60% mandate, whether you want to accept it or not.
Right, diba?
Like, this is my time. It's showtime, right? So I'm just saying, I was not surprised with that at all. And I think in a certain way, it had its own logic and it's an interesting dynamic in the Philippines. But, as I said also kanina, in fact, I agree with Amy on the RCEP issue. But to be fair, it's not like Marcos Jr. himself was not for RCEP, because the concern with RCEP is, let's talk about this very quickly, because whenever we open up our market, kinain lang tayo na ibang competitors because they were prepared when they opened up. We were not prepared. Because I'll give you an example. India is not joining RCEP. And I asked one of the top advisors ni Modi, economic advisors ni Modi the other week, and he said, we're not fools. Why should we join RCEP when we're not ready for it? First, we will build our manufacturing. Once we're ready to export and we're competitive, we'll open up so that we can use your markets. I go, that makes perfect sense, right? Pero Philippines, hindi, sama tayo dyan, maganda yan, pare, yan. Ano ba yung latest free trade dyan? Talon tayo dyan eh. So I think in fairness, even BBM had second thoughts about it, but the business community, the whole new liberal establishment said, let's join it, blah, 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 blah. So, but in fairness, Amy, she said the right thing. Kawawang mga farmers natin and sectors natin dyan. What is your reading on the whole free trade? Why does the Philippines keep on getting this free trade wrong? Or seemingly get this wrong?
Well, hindi ako entirely sure about RCEP either. Pero parang I'm willing to be persuaded either way that India case is very persuasive. Pero meron ding idea, of course, na pag nagsimula na tapos napag-iwanan ka na, parang malalaos ka na kasi they got it going already. So
right.
So I don't know, Richard. And then of course there are already, like, you can develop your manufacturing, but there are things that are worth exporting already and are probably going to work out in an RCEP situation. I don't know. I haven't really looked into RCEP. Pero parang, I'm not completely against free trade either. Like, I don't like dito sa Philippine left yung kind of boilerplate tendency to view all free trade as
As wrong as
suspect, right?
evil,
Di ba?
yeah.
To view all forms of globalization as suspect. I think parang markets work in certain areas, more protectionist efforts work in other areas. I am a huge believer though in yung idea of the infant industry, di ba? That we should protect certain infant industries na kapag bata pa yan, hindi mo dapat sinasabak ka agad yan. At dapat inaalagaan mo. This metaphor of the infant industry, dapat meron ka mang industriya na inaalagaan as if they were children. And hindi mo dapat sinasabak sa larangan ng free trade gayong kakapanganak pa lang niya, di ba? That metaphor is interesting because the metaphor of an infant industry, it's not from Asia, it's not from the third world, it comes from the US. It's a metaphor coined by Alexander Hamilton.
Right. And of course, people like Paul Krugman, right, really cut their, teeth in the trade by making very strong argument. I think that's one reason why he won the Nobel Prize version of economics, no, doon sa infant industry arguments niya. And yeah, I mean, the idea is this, the full free traders will say, just focus on what's your comparative advantage. But Korea had zero shipbuilding industry, zero automotive industry. They built their comparative advantage, but they had to protect it first before they subjected it to international competition. So I'm just saying, it's not like I have total disagreement with Aimee or total agreement with Marcos. But for me, it's just fascinating to see that one of the few legislators out there that tends to take a contrarian view, or at least actually sometimes make a good point, good criticism of some of the policies of the government, is not is not from the opposition per se. I mean, like, it's essentially Riza Ontiveros and Aimee Marcos. They're the ones that you can expect to be more or less contrarian on some of the key decisions of Marcos Jr. I just find it quite interesting.
And on the issue of the free trade, who is the true Marcosian? Is it Aimee or is it Bongbong? It's a very interesting question, diba? Because our friends in the left claim that Ferdinand Marcos was the grandfather of Filipino neoliberalism. It's such a bad argument, Maybe Ferdinand Marcos is the grandfather of Filipino crony capitalism and Filipino theft, whatever, Filipino large-scale theft. But he's not the father of Filipino neoliberalism because,
Quaderno for you is the real father. You would say Quaderno is
austerity. Ano naman yung sa kanya?
But they're related.
I guess the father, kasi neoliberalism is a kind of phenomenon from the 1970s and 1980s.
I know, but there was antecedent.
To call Quaderno is medyo avant de la lettre, after. So I guess the real father of Filipino neoliberalism, if you're looking for, is Fidel Ramos, diba? Fidel Ramos talaga yung aggressively open up the markets, diba? And then GMA, early GMA, diba? Where she said she would essentially continue Ramos policies, right? Ang peg down niya for economic governance was Fidel Ramos. I think that was the kind of neoliberal moment, yung Ramos and then early GMA. That was the real neoliberal moment. Pero si Marcos, I've been reading IMF and World Bank reports related to Marcos. Tuloy-tuloy ang complaints. This is a very protectionist economy. Ferdinand Marcos is a very protectionist president, right? It's just like, if you read the World Bank, if you take the time to actually read the World Bank and the IMF, like, the major complaint was he was not neoliberal.
He's not following the script. No, the reason why I said Quaderno is because, remember, one of the it's called neoliberalism. It's a new version of something older, and the antecedent of that is the kind of a night watchman, minimalist state, non-interventionist state. And I would say Quaderno in many ways, it's like your classical liberalism, and neoliberalism kind of built on that. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, his ideas are not too dissimilar from the Republicans arguing ahead of the Great Depression, who were saying, let the markets resolve it on its own, right? And Keynes came in and threw them out, and then neoliberalism took on the Keynes, but build on the ideas of pre-Keynesian liberalism.
That's true, and he's also the father of the central bank myth in the Philippines, which is yung central bank is a counter majoritarian institution like the Supreme Court, where an unelected bureaucrat gets to make the biggest decisions in society, in economic planning, right? So I think he's the father.
Which makes him neoliberal too, because remember, one of the arguments of neoliberalism is leave it to markets and leave it to experts. Monetary this is expert yan, when in fact this is where our friendship blossomed to the next level, is because let's be honest, this Nexus would not have happened if you didn't have the audacity to come out and say, who are you to tell us only you can discuss monetary issues when in fact these are fundamentally political and power relations issues? In
democratic issues.
Exactly. And it's not rocket science. Come on, let's not pretend economics is rocket science. This is why I don't pretend political science is rocket science. No, with basic familiarity, you can make actually reasonable judgment as a citizen. Forget about being an expert. And that's why I was very impressed with where you were coming from, except I had to do the next fighting round for you on your behalf. But usapan na yan. But here we are where we are. No, but I want to go back to this issue of why do we have such an anti-competitive economic history in the Philippines? Why are oligarchs so uncompetitive and globally when it comes to the industries that really matter? Why don't we have VinFast, all of those things? We discussed it in the previous episode, but we usually talk about monopoly, licensing, cronyism, corruption. But banking is a very big part of entrenching a specific kind of political economy, particularly the tycoon or godfather or oligarch in the Philippines. Now, speaking of that, one of the general arguments in the political science literature is that the problem the Philippines never had a development state is because the Americans never invested in a strong bureaucracy, a bureaucracy that can discipline the oligarchs, a bureaucracy that can do the proper industrial and trade policy. But at the same time, and this is where I wanted to come in and co-host, is because there's an argument that it's not like wala naman effort ang mga Amerikano to build a modern Philippines, a modern economy. Case in point, Philippine National Bank, which gave sufficiently generous funds to build the basics of the Philippine economy and all. And then the argument of our good friends is that ang corrupt kasi yung mga Filipino na nilagay dyan sa Philippine National Bank, so within 5 years daw, wala na yan. Now, you're telling me that is a kind of a gaslighting. Essentially saying, right, colonial gaslighting, saying, you should never leave governance to locals. They're just too corrupt and they're gonna
exactly.
So I think that's a better term putting it. Not Orientalism. I'll call it what it is. It's colonial gaslighting, right? Let's go to you, bro. So what is your data there?
So
new book.
So yung Philippine National Bank was in the 1910s was the first time that the Democrats took over the governance of the Philippines, diba? So Woodrow Wilson was elected president, and he sends a friend of Manuel Quezon by the name of Francis Burton Harrison, sends him to the Philippines. He becomes Governor General, and because the Democrats, ang goal nila is to have independence for the Philippines earlier, unlike the Republicans. They engage in this policy of Philippinization, whereby many of the institutions of government are transferred to Filipinos, and also economic policy making is transferred to Filipinos. The greatest economic thinker of that time, at least in mainstream discourse, during the period of Filipinization, was Sergio Osmeña. And Sergio Osmeña at this time becomes called the father of Filipino economic nationalism. His vision of economic nationalism is not the same as the Rectonian vision of economic nationalism. Rectonian vision of economic nationalism is get the Americans out from investment. Si Osmeña, ang vision niya is a more active form of economic nationalism, meaning invest in Philippine companies and make sure that there's money available.
Is it like more Japanese, Prussian influence? More Prussian?
So classic dirigism. So the Osmeña policy was threefold. There were three important institutions under the Osmeña model. Number one was the board of investments, the board of control. So the board of control was a kind of super body that looked after all national, that looked at all state businesses, right? So it was a kind of super board for the boards of all state businesses.
Meta board.
And then the second one was, I think, was a kind of investment, was an investment corporation. The name. I can't remember the name right now, but it was an investment corporation for industry. And then the third one was an investment bank for agriculture, and that was the Philippine National Bank. The Philippine National Bank was actually a very successful bank because it built it was the beginning of Philippine industrialization, according to a Japanese commentator, that era of the Philippine National Bank, and also according to one of the great economic historians, Odi Corpus. So just to I'm gonna show you a couple of graphs.
Numbers.
I'm gonna show you yung effects ng Philippine National Bank.
Ikaw ang gumawa ng graphs na yan.
Ikaw ang gumawa na tong graphs.
Yan na! Yeah, no, talaga.
So these
Ah.
are Philippine exports from 1903 to 1925. So the Philippine National Bank gets founded in 1916,
16, yeah.
right? 16,
139, yeah, 0.9, yeah.
139, and look at how steady the rise is in
Right.
exports until 19 may
May
slight
konting,
dip
yeah, but if you average
1919,
it out, yeah, it's pretty
and
high.
then 1920 pataas bumulusok,
More than
right?
doubled, yeah.
And ito yung balance of trade natin again 19 and again pataas
This is
during the period
positive
of
balance of trade, yeah.
this is let's call this the let's call this the Osmeña period.
Osmania
So
bump.
this is
The Osmania
the,
bump, yeah.
so it's actually an extremely successful program. You get modern sugar mills created. You get modern coconut processing industry. This is the high point of the kind of abaca export, right? So these are really, these are spectacular. So, but something happens. 1920, you get a huge crash, right?
Right.
1920, 1921, you get a huge crash. You see it here also, 1920 to 1921, you get negative trade, you get a negative trade balance,
It's
right?
100
By
points.
the way, nag positive trade balance lang tayo dito sa, high point of the Osmeña years, di
Right.
ba? Diyan lang
Right.
tayo nag-positive trade balance, before that hindi. So, that is called, why did that happen? So the reason why that happened is because in 1919, you had a global deflation, one of the worst deflations in the world. In fact, according to Christina Romer, it was a deflation that you would not get until the Depression. So just to put it in perspective, this was the worst deflation that the Philippines had ever had while it was under the US. Bakit may deflation? Deflation is bumababa yung presyo ng bilihin globally.
Yes,
That's bad for your export, but that's bad for your exports, because if your exports, if kung deflation, mas mura binabayaran mo for exports, bababa talaga yung presyo. Nangyari yon because nagkaroon ng armistice, end of World War I. So yung demand ng World War I, biglang bumaba siya ng todo.
The
So biglang
steroids
nag-contract lahat ng economies at that time. So it was so bad, for example, that in Japan, for instance, the Osaka silk industry virtually collapsed, right? So sabi ng central banker ng Japan, parang the economy went from the heights of Mount Fuji until the depths of like whatever, some lake. So this deflation happens, and it affects the Philippines. What happens after this deflation? There's an election in the United States, and the Republicans are back in power. So there's a deflation, there's a change of government in the United States. What the Republicans do is they send a mission in the Philippines, which I really consider a kind of hatchet job, called the Wood-Forbes mission. And the Wood-Forbes mission says, and itong Wood-Forbes mission, sabi, i-investigate mo kung whether or not ready ba yung Philippines for independence. And one of the things that the Wood-Forbes mission did was they said the Philippines is not ready for independence because of many things. They said things like, for example, we botched daw healthcare in the Philippines, tumaas yung flu. Well, this was the period of the Spanish flu. Of course, pataas yung flu in 1920, right? So pataas din yung Spanish flu sa US at that time, but they blamed Filipinos for that. And then they said, well, they're not ready to govern their country because the PNB collapsed.
Yeah,
right? Because
that's what I'm saying.
The PNB collapsed, and because they're too corrupt to handle the PNB. Now, they blamed in particular the corruption of an Osmeña crony by the name of Venancio Concepcion, who was the president of the Philippine National Bank. Now, on paper, Venancio Concepcion naman talaga was nothing more than an Osmeña crony. He was actually a general in the Philippine Revolution, and he had replaced H. Parker Willis as president of the Philippine National Bank. Now, H. Parker Willis was actually the head of the Fed, who was loaned to the Philippines. He was that experienced, and then we were replaced by an Osmeña crony. So, asama talaga ng optics. And then nahuli si Concepcion loaning money to his wife's company through the PNB.
Right.
So kulong ngayon si Concepcion. So you had this huge scandal. In the Philippine and the Wood-Forbes report used that scandal to say the Philippine National Bank collapsed because of the corruption of Filipinos dahil nakulong si Osmeña.
So they
The problem,
exaggerated them.
the problem here is yes, there was corruption, but and then well, let's not get to the problem with that muna. So yung Wood Forbes report ngayon, it becomes the basis of a book by Peter Stanley about Philippine history, and he talks about the Philippine National Bank as one of the reasons why ang corrupt ng Filipinos. That book then gets the information of that book then gets cited in State and Society in the Philippines by Patricia Abinales and Donna Moroso. It gets cited in Paul Hutchcroft's book, Booty Capitalism, right? And then it gets cited in other studies. It gets cited in Al McCoy's Policing American Empire. So kung i-trace mo, all of these arguments against funding the Philippine business, they're all essentially citations of the Peter Stanley book or the Wood Forbes report, which was a hatchet job, right? Which was a blatant hatchet job, and we based so much of our historiography on that one crazy hatchet job. Now, if you look at that hatchet job, there are many things incorrect about it. Number one, I went to the files of William Cameron Forbes. I went to his papers, and I looked in Harvard, and I looked at the documents, and I looked at the parts of the report na hindi niya sinali dun sa formal report. One letter I found from William Cameron Forbes, he said, actually, the most corrupt people in the Philippine National Bank were not the Filipinos. It was the Americans. It was the Americans in the Hong Kong branch who took and gave bribes, right? Now, si Concepcion was corrupt. He loaned money to his wife's company, but he was never convicted of bribes. Forbes himself admitted that it was the Americans who took bribes. So it wasn't the Filipinos who were most corrupt, except, Forbes didn't add that to the document. I had to find that in Harvard, and nahanap ko talaga, literally torn piece of paper with that admission. Talagang
hindi siya na
mukhang literally tinanggal talaga sa report. And they say the unfortunate truth is that the Americans were the corrupt ones. That's the first. And then the second major problem is that let's just go back to the graph, shall we?
Yeah, please.
The collapse of the Philippine National Bank happened in 1921. Look, that's not corruption.
That's a deflation.
Corruption cannot lead to 73.2% trade surplus to a negative 55.5. You cannot steal your way into a trade surplus that bad in the span of 2 years. You cannot do that. What is that? That is essentially a global economic crisis, which it was. Now, 1920, 1921, according to our best friend Adam Tooze, our hero, he says it is the most underrated economic crisis in world history. And indeed, if you look at the Philippine National Bank history, it is the worst. It is the most underrated crisis in Philippine history, because we never refer to it as a global. We never refer to it as a global economic crisis. We refer to it as a corruption crisis. But if you look at the data, it wasn't even itong mga account ni Hutchcroft, itong mga account ni Joe Studwell, they say that the Philippine National Bank basically collapsed the Philippine economy. Look, we're back into trade surplus by 1922, 1923. It wasn't even a bad crisis, right? And the thing is, the Philippine officials, including at that time Salvador Laguda, who was the Secretary of Finance, was already saying hanggang 1923 lang to. And yet the Americans were saying, no, it's bad. You've ruined your economy. Laguda was saying it's a crisis. Just wait until 1923. Tama si Laguda, oh.
So it was a temporary.
Except has anybody quoted Laguda? No, they quote the racist Republicans, and they expect us to base our economic history on a hatchet job. Like, what is wrong? I mean, Paul is my friend, but what is wrong? What is wrong with you, man? Like, this is just, I mean, this is so bad. Like, this is really so bad. It's like, it's just bad historical writing. It's like, parang
Okay.
para mo sinabi nung 2000, kunwari may nag-collapse na bangko nung Pilipinas nung 2007, 2008, nung time of the greatest banking crisis in the world. Para mong sinabi nag-collapse yun dahil sa corruption. It's so bad, man. It's just like, oh my God, like, it's horrendously bad.
I understand, bro, but remember the context of Paul Hushkar, and you know, not to dismiss your very good intervention. My point is, like, we had horrible corruption later on when the Americans were no longer around. So one would argue if you just gave Filipinos enough time in the 1920s, they would have run the whole thing to the ground.
That
argument?
I don't know, but you know, it's so brief. And then the other thing I found, in the Wood Forbes report was another excluded section. Sabi ni Cameron Forbes was, actually, my recommendation, and this never made it to the final report, was my recommendation was that the Philippines should be made part of the Federal Reserve System. That's a very revealing revelation. Why? The Philippine National Bank did not collapse because it was extraordinarily corrupt. There was a free rider, according to Barry Eichengreen, because of the war, there was a free rider problem in all US banks. Bakit? Kasi mataas yung demanda wartime, so talagang invest lahat ng banks. According to Barry Eichengreen, in the 1920-1921 crisis, all US banks went into liquidity, nagkaroon ng liquidity problems, lahat ng US banks. Every single US bank encountered liquidity problems. Why is it that the Philippine National Bank almost collapsed? It's not because it was extraordinarily corrupt, because it almost collapsed because it was not bailed out by the Fed, because it was not part of the Fed, right? So the Philippine National Bank was expected to operate like a US bank, but without the guarantee of a Fed bailout. Right. So like all local banks in the US were collapsing in 1920, 1921, but they were bailed out by the New York Fed. I mean, Richard, this is the height of absurdity in terms of blaming Filipino industry. I mean,
you're saying Orientalism.
You can't get any more absurd than this. Like
Orientalism on steroids.
It's not. I mean, I'm not saying that these people intentionally did it, because like these are some close friends of mine, and I said, like, you know, my mentor in fact was, you know, ragged on the Philippine National Bank, you know, one of my closest friends, in his, you know, stellar textbook, State and Society in the Philippines. But it's just like, until we treat these colonial documents with a little more with a little bit of more of a critical mind, we're not going to get
skepticism.
Healthy skepticism, right?
Exactly.
I mean, wow.
Don't take it on face value. Yep. Because I completely agree with you, because a lot of problem we see is like, I mean, the whole nonsense about di sana colonize pa rin tayo, di mas maayos na tayo. Like this whole defeatist ideological shadow. I mean, it's a curse for the Philippines, right? I mean, in many ways, this idea that don't leave it to the Filipinos because they cannot do it, that always has sapped our self-confidence. Now, yes, Marcos regime failed on many fronts. There was corruption and all, but I think the attempt at making us a more manufacturing-driven economy was correct. We should have just done it better after Marcos. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think that's the problem. Things that went wrong under Marcos helped liberals to argue that the whole nationalist, export-oriented project doesn't make sense and all. And I think that's ridiculous. And I think it also fits into this idea that we cannot be left to our own devices. We should I mean, God bless his soul. I mean, the late President Aquino, diba? Parang, I just didn't feel, I never felt that administration had the vision of making us a manufacturing powerhouse. I mean, I just didn't feel it. I mean, like, there was always this happiness about state intervention. It was very, very, and for me, it's interesting because I know Aquino, God bless his soul, he was actually a very big fan of German politics. But I hope he was a fan of German. Yeah, he was a big fan of Merkel. Kaya nga, di ba, yung medyo siya, unemotional, to put it nicely, about things was because he wanted to be the above the fray, Cancelo style. And I said, that doesn't work. Philippines is Berlusconi. This Philippines is Italy. You have to. But my sense is he didn't read proper German political economy. I think he read more the libertarian, you know, kind of like an Austrian school version of German politics. So that's really sad for me because yun nga, when we had clean presidents or relatively more competent presidents, I mean, essentially I can talk about Ramos and Aquino, right? If you look at post-EDSA presidents, they're the two who did better than everyone else on average. Both of them completely lack this vision of making us aggressive. I mean, Ramos, I have an excuse for him. Again, I'm not saying this because we're a friend, the late, but dude, I mean, Ramos inherited essentially a bankrupt state. Where I blame him is the privatization process, which was easily hijacked. But the privatization logic was really under desperate condition. I rather talk on Aquino bailing out a lot of people who shouldn't have been bailed out.
Yung kay Ramos, parang some of yung privatization, you can even forgive some of that. Yung telco privatization, for example. Naalala ko nung bata ako, you had to wait for 2 years to get the phone line.
Yeah, exactly.
Or tapos pumasok yung Bayantel, private, 'di ba, Lopez Company. Next thing you know, may telephone na ka na in 3 months time, 'di ba? Parang yun yung first, alam ko when we moved to our house in the early 2000s, Bayantel lang talaga makukuha na in the late 90s.
90s, yes, 90s.
Bayantel lang talaga yung kaya namin makuha eh.
Yeah, so like I don't want to be also unfair to Ramos too much. I mean, like he inherited a bankrupt state, and that state should not have been bankrupt if we got rid of a lot of odious debt. When we had the revolutionary power. It's not like Enrile and Honasans were into the bailout finance part, right? This is a different part, right? I mean, so I don't know. I mean, I don't think the coup d'etat should have been an excuse for us not doing the finance part correctly. And I think Winnie Sud and others would completely agree with where we're coming from on this issue. But yun nga, that's why I understand bakit you're a big fan of Jokno, if I could put it fairly, because I feel you're saying Jokno is the one guy with the Cojones Award, diba? He's the guy, like I got it from Bill Maher, Cojones Award. Like he was the one guy who said, hey, we have to do something different here, right? We have to spend, we have to risk, just go out there, let 1,000, flowers bloom and whatever. And so far, I think a lot of good things happen in the past years under Jokno. I mean, imagine if there was no EJK, imagine if there was no all this Tatay Digong geopolitics. We could have a very different reading of the Duterte era, like completely different reading. Because I would support him on Bangsamoro. I think he did well there. The infrastructure spending, I said good job on that. I don't know. I'm just saying it's just a tragedy it's just tragic that Duterte derailed the whole good things that was also happening with Jokno and all of those people.
I think Duterte knew that he could get away with killing people if he had a good economy. Kasi si Duterte gusto lang naman niya pumatay, 'di ba? So essentially yun naman talaga yung una niya, yun lang talaga naman hilig ni Duterte.
Lang policy drug war eh. So
ang hilig lang naman talaga niya death, 'di ba? He doesn't understand these economics. And he really doesn't understand. So he's just like, these guys, I think they'll do well.
He's self-admittedly completely ignoramus when it comes to Kaya I see the value of what you're doing, because what you're saying is that, yes, given horror, horrible things that person did, but let's not forget the economic, experimentation and some of the good things that happened, that just happened to have Duterte as the president. It's not like Jokno was asking Duterte's advice when he was doing this. That guy he has no idea what was happening, right? So the social services, economic investments, kaya na-appreciate ko yung sinabi mo sa Gini coefficient, dun sa ano. But you know what's interesting? I was showing the Gini coefficient graphs that you were also talking about the World Cup. My friends in Korea and Taiwan and all, and they were like shocked how little it still changed, right? Because
ang taas pa rin. Ang taas pa rin eh.
What?
Ang laki na pinaba, pero ang taas pa rin. Like, shocking.
Like, it's here, it came here, but their expectation is it's somewhere here because all other Asian countries are here. So for them, they were not impressed with the decline. They were impressed with how they were horrified by how high the baseline was to begin with. So parang, okay, like, you just have to understand how. But last word, bro, I want to talk about this because, so how do you understand the Philippines? So we're going to go back to the VinFast issue that we discussed in the previous episode. Why? Okay, I understand how the U.S. colonial project undermined our first industrialization drive. I understand how Marcos' crony capitalism undermined his own industrialization drive. I understand how neoliberalism and forced privatization also undermined our manufacturing or industrialization drive. But the other side of the coin is also our own supposed chaebols who never became chaebols, right? And they're just sticking to low mid intermediate end services, yung iba land grabbers, yung iba Karenism, you know. What is your reading on that as a Filipino historian, economic historian, or budding economic historian, whatever you want to put it?
Well, kasi 'di ba parang for most of the 1950s yung chaebols mo were not encouraged to chaebols in quotes, 'di ba?
Kaysa oligarchs. Yeah.
We really didn't encourage anyone to export until from 1950 to 1970, right? So nung pumasok yung export orientation under Marcos, in many ways we already had missed the ball kasi nag-shift na to export industrialization early on after very short. Ang Asian country kasi yung ISI mabilis lang, di ba? Mag-ISI sila up until that point where domestic companies can essentially feed you, right? Pero yung Latin American model is ISI until the point of manufacturing, di ba? Never mo i-export orient.
Yeah.
So, ang argument ni Jerry Sikat early on, and he made this argument in 1968, 1969, before he joined the Marcos regime. So, in many ways, this is not him making an excuse kasi he joined the Marcos regime late 69, early 1970. Sabi niya, even if i-depreciate mo yung peso in 69 and 70, and even if you turned export-oriented, in many ways, dehado ka na. Now, and that's why it's important for me to say that he said this in 68. Kasi if he said this in 71, nagpapalusot na siya. He said it before.
So that's an honest assessment.
Therefore, there's a kind of honesty. There's a kind of honesty to that statement.
Correct. Last point, bro. How do you think that the Philippines has a chance to kind of, kasi the next wave that is coming before AI takes over everything, right, including everything, is what, for the lack of a better word, let's just call it China plus, right? So now the push is by Apple, a lot of big companies, to get out of China as much as possible so that they can, the term there is their risk, right? Not decouple, but the risk. And I think that's where there's a lot of chance for Philippines to kind of make himself felt. Na parang maybe you want to bring some of these products here, at least even the intermediate, lower end versions of manufacturing, because the Vietnamese and Indians are very aggressive on this. Indonesians are also coming in. What is your sense on that? Again, we're not saying this as industrial policy expert, but from your own historical understanding, there is a mini wave coming, which let's just call it China plus. What do you think the Philippines should do? Do you think there's a way we can do a mini developmental strategy on that front? Or hopeless case ng Philippines, hanggang services na lang tayo forever. Let's just hope level up services.
Hindi ko talaga alam. Kasi parang, is there a way to turbocharge services? Kasi in a way, diba, there's a discussion now about India, right? About whether or not, kasi it just overtook China as the world's most populous nation. They're saying, can it be the next China? But they're saying, well, not really, because hindi manufacturing in India. But in defense of India, some people have said that, well, so what if it's not manufacturing? The world is very different now. Services are more important, right? Because services, because of the internet, are now exportable. Diba? Dati kasi kung service, kailangan mo talaga pumunta. It's not as exportable. It's like, you have to go there. And so largely services service a domestic market, right? Kasi walang internet now. Because of internet, like, services are are more exportable. You can kind of make kind of foreign exchange reserves as a result of services. And so maybe that is the developmental path of India, which would be different from the developmental path of China, and that's how they become a world power. I'm not sure I'm persuaded by that.
I'm not at all. Like, it's good if you're an IT expert in Bangalore, but good luck if you're, I don't know, you know what I'm saying, fill in the gaps. I don't know how the internet monetization is going to help. If you're a vlogger, maybe it's good for you in India, you know what I'm saying? Or if you're online hotshot professor. But I'm not sure that's going to help a lot of people, like, 600 million under poverty line, in India. I'm not sure how internet is going to help them, because a lot of them don't even have access to a basic sanitary. Like, toilet is a big issue in India. One reason Modi is so famous is he made sure 120 million people got toilet or something like that. Right? So I don't know, because that's what I always hear. Every time in India, there's this digital minister guy talks about the next Silicon Valley and all. And I look around in India, so like, dude, I'm not sure all of these people will be in Silicon Valley, right? These people just need the basics, right?
Oo nga eh.
But that's why I'm saying manufacturing really honestly is still the only way in town.
Ayaw mo pa rin sumuko, Richard, no? Even if we make the argument na exportable na talaga ang service, that you can consider services exports, right? Ayaw mo talagang sumuko dun sa mga
it works, but it's minimal. For me, hindi talaga, I'm
tangible, kaya mong hawakan.
For me, maybe it's good for you and me, people like you and me, right? But I just doubt it works for. I hate the term they use, semi-skilled, low-skilled. I mean, who dare you to say these people are low-skilled? Let's just say people who are not white-collar or professional jobs. I just don't think you can get high-end services make sense. But you really need economies of scale, manufacturing, large scale to really get people from the essentially what every other newly industrial country has done. No?
Alam mo, Richard, sometimes naisip ko lang, no? Meron ding sense of pride. Like, if you enter
fast, right? You have your own car in other countries. I would love to see that, a Filipino car in another country. I'm sorry, I would buy it, even if I don't know
I hate Filipino pride, yung parang any acknowledgement of the Philippines. But sometimes, you know, if I watch an NBA game, tapos yung nag-a-advertise doon, Tanduay Ram.
Yeah, I know. Or Jollibee.
Wow, Filipino or Jollibee. Diba? Parang, wow, we're actually making stuff that people are interested in, di ba?
Foreign. Yeah. I mean, I feel when I'm in Spain or Europe, and then I see like Filipino brands or Filipino businessman doing well there. Exactly. Now, imagine how much more proud you were if you see Filipino brand of cars, Filipino brand of cell phones, because China used to just assemble. Now you have Chinese cars. I don't know, all of these things. So I don't know, for me, psychological din yun, hindi lang siya economic. But both are important because nationalism is fundamentally psychological phenomenon. So
sabi, may interesting article si Armand Fabella.
Right,
which is he was saying recently na okay, bumagsak yung presyo ng piso, di ba?
Correct.
Okay, and we already absorbed the pain for that. Nagkaroon na tayo ng inflationary crisis. Correct. Now, sabi niya, may tendency yung central bank na every time bumagsak yung piso, they will signal na paakitin ulit nila yung presyo.
Correct.
And sabi ni Fabella, what that does for potential investors in an export industry, export manufacturing industry is like, nag-depreciate yung peso, fake naman yan eh. Hindi naman yan, paakitin ulit ng central bank yan. Hindi na ako papasok. So sabi ni Fabella, one way to really encourage exports is, well, pag bumagsak na yan, wag mong isi-signal na patataasin mo. Like, the signal you send to the market is, okay, bumagsak, masakit, we already absorbed the inflation, pero kinain na namin. Right. We're going to maintain it at that lower rate. Right. And sabi ni Fabella, we have a history from the 1990s of always signaling to the market na hindi paakatin natin yan. Diba? Parang, so that's one very like parang parang very immediate yan way of encouraging export manufacturing, diba? Just the right central bank signals. And I think like, si Fabella, I think is close to the central bank. So, probably pinapakinggan niya.
My reading on that, I think Medallia also kind of said something similar about that. Now we also have to look at the export ports. I think Chelito Habito also kind of talk about that. Although the counter argument would be, yeah, it makes sense, but we don't really have much of a manufacturing sector to speak of. But that's a chicken and egg question, right?
Chicken and egg nga, yeah. That's what Fabella would say, chicken and egg.
Exactly. But it's chicken and egg. So, kailan na tayo mag-build? Kung parati signal pa upwards natin yung peso, maging import-oriented tayo for life. So that's why I kind of say, yeah, might as well, we took the punches, let's push forward. And by the way, a lot of inflation is not also about peso, it's because of sugar import, all of this.
That's true.
Yeah, kalokohan lang yan. So dapat Marcos comes in strong and deal with that accordingly. Thank you very much, bro. I really appreciate it. I can see all the fans here. We're looking forward to this, including talking about Daryl Yap. Sorry, medyo seryoso na yung usapan. Next time na lang. May Chester din yata si Lelo. Hindi
wala.
Yan na naman tayo, bro. Thank you so much, bro. I appreciate it. Enjoy it. May UFC yata mamaya. Hindi. Next week pa yung UFC. That's good, bro.
Salamat. And thank you for letting me share my research on the PNB. 7 years ko nang inaaral ang PNB from the 1920s.
It was very serendipitous, right? I just dropped the note on the PNB. It's Joe Studwell, and then you went ballistic. No. I'm Orientalist yan. Okay. All right, okay, go ahead. Sa'yo na yan, bro. Supportive lang ako, bro. I'm very supportive. No problem. But I
can make sense. Thank you.
Salamat, bro, and looking forward to talk to you more. Hopefully next time UFC na rin.
Okay, sige. All right.
God bless. Talk to you soon.
Ikaw rin. Okay, ingat.
Yeah.